So good morning and good evening and good afternoon. Welcome to this session on women and work, one of the first sessions for the third day of the IUSP conference. I'm Farzana Afridi. I'll be the chair for this session, and Kathleen Beagle is going to be moderating the question and answers. We have four very interesting papers lined up. And the first presenter in our schedule is Herman Kapnang at the University of Paris, but I believe he is not with us at the moment. Oh, he's here. So perfect. Okay, so Herman, you're there. So we can start with the first presentation on gender and informal sector earning gaps in Cameroon. And before we go forward, I just wanted to let you know that the way we are going to do this is that we'll have all the four presentations, the videos running. After that, it'll be followed by the discussions where the presenters will discuss each other's papers. And the papers will be discussed in the order that the last presenter will be discussing the first paper. The second presenter will discuss uh, the so the last so Dhanushk will be discussing Herman's paper. Nakechi's paper will be discussed by Leah, um, and Herman will be discussing Nakechi's paper. Is that correct?
I think I'm discussing Danush's paper. No?
Okay, you are discussing the niche paper. Okay, so everybody knows which paper they're discussing. We're going to be rotating. And then after that, we'll have the general chat and discussion. We'll open the floor for further questions. Okay, so over to the presentations now.
Hello to everyone. My name is Kabna Eman Brice, former student at Institute of Development Economics and Social Study in University of Paris 1, Pantheron Sorbonne. Actually, I am working in Central Bank of Central African State in Cameroon. My presentation focus on gender and informal sector earning gaps in Cameroon. Level of literacy, ignorance, and surplus labor, and thus face high level of exploitation. In the case of gender, the need for inequality reducing policy has been explicitly placed on the poverty reduction agenda defined by the Millennium Development Goals, MDG, in 2000. As MDG 3 is specifically aimed at promoting gender equality and empowering women. The ILO defines informal employment as employment that does not provide coverage in the institution of social protection scheme. Using data from household consumption survey carried out in all cities in Cameroon, we shed new light on the issue of labor market disparity. We address a number of questions: are gender earning gaps sizable and similar? Are there any labor market characteristics that explain variation across gender? The study, which tests the output of the investment in human capital by comparing two segments of the labor market stack, in general by dividing the sample into two sectors. In this article, we describe the implementation of the maximum likelihood algorithm to fit the endogenous switching regression models. Model with endogenous switching can be fed one equation at a time, but have a two-step least square or maximum likelihood estimation. In this model, a switching equation sort individual over two different states, which one regime observes. The econometric problem of fitting a model with endogenous switching arises in a variety of settings in labor economics, the modeling of housing demand, and the modeling of market in disequilibrium. Consider the following model, which describes the behavior of an agent with two regression equations and a criterion function E that determines which regime the agent is. Ok, on fait. Je suis en réunion là. Est-ce qu'on peut s'appeler dans une heure? The latent variable that determines the sector in which individual is employed. WE is the wage of individual E in sector G. Z is a vector of characteristics that influence the decision regarding the sector of employment. Beta 1, beta 2 are vector of parameters, and UA, epsilon 1, epsilon 2 are the disturbance terms. They observe dichotomous realization E of the latent variable E star, of whether the individual E is employed in a particular sector has the following form. The assumption that is often made in this type of model is that the sector of employment is endogenous to wage. Some unobserved characteristics that influence the probability to choose a particular sector of employment could also influence the wage the individual receives once he is employed. Neglecting their selective effect is likely to give a false picture of the relative earning position in both the public and private sector. The simultaneous ML estimation corrects for the selection bias in sectoral wage estimate. To start to show you the result, let me present our country. Cameroon is a lower middle income country with a population of over 25 million located along the Atlantic Ocean. It is the largest economy in the Central African Economic and Monetary Community, a region experiencing an economic crisis triggered by the steep fall in oil price. Regardless poverty line, while 39% of the national population live below the poverty line, this rate rises to 51.5% for women and 79.2% of them are unemployed. Boys have a privileged access to education. The gross enrollment rate is 125% in primary school, comparative to 110% for girls. 65% are enrolled in secondary school compared to just 53% for girls. Women spend an average of 8.2 hours more per week than men on unpaid household tax. 16.8% of women benefit of a credit for any use. The sample used to analyze the determinant of the wage consists of 6,095 eighths of household divided on all the national triangle. In this picture, we can show in first graph that there is a gender pay gap between female and men focused on wage. The second graph is show that people who work in formal sector have more probability than people who work in informal to earn more. And the last picture show the difference between rural and urban zone. Firstly, we implement the probit selection model. The dependent variable is whether the individual is informal or informal sector. In this household sample, 2/3 work in informal and 1/3 informal. The mean age is 14% are male. The analysis of the marginal effect revealed that females have 6% likely more than male to work in informal sector. In the same way, compared to the worker of the agricultural sector, the percentage in the industrial sector reduced from approximately 13% the probability to work in the informal against 8% only the trade and nearly 14% in the service. Indeed, the fact of residing in rural zone increased from approximately 10% probability of working in the informal sector. The exogenous variables in the wage regression are based on a typically mean set type specification and include such individual characteristics. The result of the wage regression in the formal and informal sector are reported in the table below. Sorry for the show. Model 1 as shown in figure 3 use this approach to predict log hourly wage, controlling for education, hours worker, demographic groups, work experience, and job tenure. If there is a gender wage penalty, then the variable women should have a negative coefficient. Using this somewhat naive model, gender wage penalty is measured and appears to associate with an approximative 10% decline in wage informal sector and around 13% in informal sector. A widely used method for studying difference in wage between two separate groups has been developed in both Osaka and Blinder. This Osaka method decomposes wage difference between groups into two parts, an unsplit portion and unsplit portion. It is shown that women on average 51,000 lower wage than men. The decomposition output reports the mean prediction by gender and they are different in the first sample with selection bias. In Apple, $1 equal to 55 francs CFA. In Cameroon, the mean of log wage is 5.28, equal to 1,097 francs CFA for men and 4.98 for women, yielding a wage gap of 0.29, equal to 51,000. Comparing the result with the output in the first estimation reveals that the incorrect wage of women and highly biased downward 4.98 versus the selective corrected 4.67, and the wage gap is somewhat underestimated 0.29 versus the correct 0.16. This paper has provided robust quantitative evidence for the existence of a gender wage penalty in Cameroon, in particular using data from the Nationally Representative Household Survey dataset. Our empirical estimates show that there is a positive and statistically significant 12% gender difference in the wage in informal sector and around 6% in formal sector. Using Cameroon data, it was found that educational level directly influenced the gender wage penalty. Then mainstream the gender perspective at all levels of policy is one aspect of efficiently enhanced gender equality. Gender equality is not just about economic empowerment. It is a moral imperative. It is about fairness and equity and includes many political, social, and cultural dimensions. Gender equality, however, is also a key factor in self-report well-being and happiness across the world. Regarding disparity in earnings, the results suggest the establishment of a set of activity policy on the labor market focused on certain groups with a low probability of transitioning from unemployment to employment. Then it seems important to increase both the quantity and quality of data by gender and improve evaluation of public policy and ensure equal access to finance for male and female entrepreneurs. Formalization programs can have a relatively large impact on women, given that the burden of complying with government regulation is heavier for the low-scale business, where female earners are prevalent. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. So our next paper is by Nkechi Owu at the University of Ghana.
Hello, everyone. I'm pleased to present our research titled, Does Job Security Affect Fertility and Fertility Intentions in Ghana? Examining the evidence. This is research that has been conducted by myself and Monica Lambon-Kwefu. This is the outline that the presentation will take. Now, the link between fertility and employment has been examined by both demographers and economists for many years. The association has been found to be largely negative. That is, having children has been associated with large, long-term, and negative effects on women's earnings, something that is commonly referred to as the motherhood penalty. Now, more recently, research focus has shifted to the link between fertility and the characteristic of women's employment, that is the job security. Here, job security can be described as the perceived stability and continuance of one's employment with an organization. Now, there are three possible channels through which job security might be expected to affect family formation. The first, commonly referred to as the spillover model, posits that job security would strengthen women's desire for children. This is because women who are employed in secure positions would be more willing and able to have children and then take care of them. Now, according to the compensation hypothesis, job insecurity rather would strengthen women's desire for children. And this is because faced with the economic uncertainties, women would likely seek out social relationships as a support system, given the present labor market unpredictability. And having children is one way to do this. And then finally, according to the segmentation theory, there's no observable link between job security and family formation. So essentially, they do not affect one another. Now, questions relating to the link between women's fertility outcomes and their job security have been explored largely in developed country contexts. Now, the contribution of the present research is to explore the relationship in a developing country setting, that is Ghana. So we will be investigating the effect of job security on women's childbearing behaviors and intentions among female paid employees in the country. Now, to answer our research question, we're going to be using data from the 2017 wave of the Ghana Living Standards Survey. This is a nationally representative household survey that includes information on about 15,000 households. There's also detailed data on economic and demographic characteristics of individuals. Now, for the purposes of this research, the analyses are going to be restricted to paid female employees in the sample. Our dependent variable is women's fertility behaviors and their intentions, and we measure these in two ways. First, by the number of children ever born, and then secondly, by women's stated intention to delay their future births. The main explanatory variable is the measure of job security, and we measure this as whether a woman reports that she has a written, verbal, or no work contract with her employer. The explanatory variables are women's age, their marital status, education, whether or not they are using a current method of contraception, household wealth status, their salary, wages, their occupation, religion and ethnicity, and then finally, whether or not they reside in rural, urban areas, and then what parts of the country, what regions in the country that they live in. Now, we'd like to show you some descriptive statistics from the data that we're using. On this slide, we're showing the proportion of women and men who are paid employees by the type of contract that they have with their employer. So if we look at the bar for women, for example, we can see that about 19% of women do not have a contract with their employer, 34% report that they have a verbal contract, and then 47% report that they have a written contract, which we assume would confer the highest level of job security. With respect to men, 22% of them report that they don't have a contract, 36% and 42% of them report that they have verbal and then written contracts respectively. So in summary, about 80% of the women in our sample report that they do have a written or a verbal contract. Now on this slide, we're showing, again, descriptive statistics indicating, on average, the fertility outcomes by women's job security status. So we are showing average children ever born and delayed future births by women who have no contract versus those who have either a written or a verbal contract. And we notice that for women who don't have a contract, on average, they have a higher number of children ever born compared to women who have either a written or a verbal contract. And this difference is highly statistically significant. We also notice that the proportion of women who report an intention to delay childbirth in the future is lower for women who do not have contracts compared to women who have either a written or a verbal contract. And again, this is highly significant. So this indicates that women with no contract or with relatively less secure job positions have more children and are also less willing to postpone future births compared to women with more job security, as evidenced by the presence of a written or a verbal contract. Now, with respect to our methodology, we run a Bayes regression model where we regress fertility on our measure of job security, controlling for other variables. As mentioned before, we measure fertility in two different ways. One, by the number of children ever born, and because of the count nature of this dependent variable, we employ a Poisson regression model. Secondly, we also measure fertility as women's stated intention to postpone future births. And given the binary nature of their responses, we employ a probit model for this regression. Now, job security is a dummy variable for women who report that they have written, verbal, or no contracts with their employers. And X is the set of explanatory variables that I presented earlier on. And then we also have the error term. Now, on this slide, I'm showing the empirical results from our Bayes, Poisson, and probit regression models. Now, the full set of results can be found in the paper, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just showing the main variables of interest. And now, using women with no contract as our base group, we can see that women who have written contracts are associated with fewer number of children ever born, and then they are also more likely to delay their births in the future. Now, these results can be explained by the cultural context and also by the employment environment in Ghana. Now, in Ghana, it's been noted that paid female employees can experience some financial penalties as a result of their taking time away from their jobs to take care of children. And therefore, for women who are employed in secure job positions, having children or leaving their jobs to take care of these children can lead to very high costs, such as losing their jobs or taking a cut with respect to their earnings and so on. In Ghana also, the cultural context prescribes that women should bear heavier burdens of childcare responsibilities. And also, given the few affordable options for outsourcing these types of responsibilities, it would be difficult for women to try to balance their job positions, particularly in secure positions, with their childcare responsibilities. And so therefore, it's not surprising that women in these secure positions are not enthusiastic about having children, or because, as I said before, it would confer significant costs that could interfere with their labor market experiences. Now, although there's some research that supports our findings that job security can have a negative effect on fertility, this conclusion differs from other studies that have been carried out in other country contexts. So, for example, other studies have found that fertility can be higher when employment is more stable. Now, these differences in outcomes may be expected because it's largely dependent on country-specific factors. So, for example, differences in social welfare and availability of unemployment protection can explain these differences in the outcomes. Now, the results from our Bayes model, Bayes, Poisson, and probit models have been presented, but we are, however, very aware that these estimates could be biased, given that female employees could be self-selecting themselves into particular jobs due to unobserved characteristics that may also affect their childbearing decisions. And to correct for this potential self-selection, we employ a propensity score matching technique. So here, propensity scores are generated from observable characteristics of women, and then it's used to produce a pseudo-control group of women who are similar to the treatment group. Now, the point of the selection of these women into the treatment group would more closely resemble a random assignment. And these propensity scores are combined with the nearest neighbor matching technique and to further reduce selection bias and estimate the average treatment on the treated, the ATT. And we'd like to now present the results after the propensity score technique has been employed. Now, initially, when we don't engage in the matching exercise, we find that the results are similar to what we had observed for the Poisson and then the probit regression models. So it looks as if women in secure job positions are associated with fewer children and are also more likely to delay their births in the future. However, once we control for self-selection within our study, we find that the initially observed negative correlation between job security and fertility is no longer significant. So women in secure job positions don't have significantly lower fertility compared to similar women who do not have such secure jobs. Now, this would indicate that the earlier observed negative effect of job security is attributable to unobserved characteristics of women who are selecting into these jobs and not directly as a result of the security that these jobs confer. So for example, we could have a situation where particularly career-oriented women would self-select into more secure jobs and have fewer children. And then although these are characterized by lower pay, family-oriented women would also self-select into less secure, but jobs with more flexibility so that they can take care of their children adequately. Now, there is an acknowledged incompatibility between work and family responsibilities that women face in Ghana and then in many parts of the world. It is likely that some women may be sacrificing their economic well-being in the quest to take care of their children. It could also be the case that there are some women who are sacrificing their family life in pursuit of their careers. It is important that attempts be made to try to ease the work-family incompatibilities that women face. So for example, workplaces should be encouraged to create nurseries to cater to the needs of working mothers. Additionally, although it had been discussed in the past in the policy arena, this has been put on hold, but I think it's time to revive the discussion about extending women's maternity leave from 3 months to 6 months. This would allow them to at least exclusively breastfeed during these critical early months of a child's life. Other family-friendly policies like paternity leave should also be pursued because it would relieve women of their childcare responsibilities and prevent them from taking drastic decisions relating to their labor market participation. There should also be the development of publicly provided and affordable childcare centers. And finally, I think that it will be important to reevaluate social and cultural norms that designate childcare as the exclusive domain of women. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take your questions now.
Perfect. Excellent presentation. So our next presenter is Leah Rouanet from the World Bank.
Hello, so this is a paper entitled "I'd rather be a hammer than a needle. Can information on returns desegregate the labor market?" And so this is evidence from a randomized experiment in the Republic of Congo, and it's joint work with Marine Gassi and Lassina Traoré. And I would also like to thank Joséphine Tassi for great research assistance. So the starting point of this study is the fact that men and women are concentrated in different occupations. This segregation in the labor market results in gender inequality in earnings. This is a well-documented fact, but there is actually very little research in low-income countries on this topic. And so the question we are asking ourselves is, how can we get more women to cross over to higher return trades, which are generally non-traditional trades for them? And more specifically, can providing information on sector-specific earnings lower gender segregation in the labor market? So more specifically, we have several research questions that we are trying to answer with these experiments. So first one is, if we provide information on sector-specific earnings, how does that impact men's and women's earnings estimates? The second question is, if we provide them with this information, does this have an impact on their choice of trade? More specifically, are women and men more likely to pick male-dominated trades, which have higher returns? And if we turn to some specific trades, do we also see some movement there? An important question we are asking in this context is whether providing this information has an impact on men and women training outcomes. This is an important question because we know that in youth employment program, take-up of programs, attendance, graduation of training are important issues, and that these are very often low, specifically for women. So we want to make sure that if we manage to have more women crossing over to male-dominated trades, in the training, they do remain in the training until the end. So this is something we're going to look at today. And the last point is about heterogeneity. And so we are asking ourselves which individuals are more impacted by the information treatment. And this will be important in terms of policy implications, as you will see. So this experiment takes place in the Republic of Congo, and more specifically in the context of a government-sponsored vocational training, which was targeting youth in the two main cities of the country, which are Brazzaville and Port-Noir. So the way the program happened is that there was a sensitization campaign before the application started. And then 10 application centers opened in the two cities of Brazzaville and Port-Noir. When people showed up to the application center, they were asked to fill some personal data. And then they were randomly assigned to two rooms where we showed two different versions of a video. The control group saw a video with a description of the training program options that were offered to them. The treatment group saw exactly the same video, plus some information on median earnings in each trade offered in the program. After they saw the video, the participants were asked to do an on-the-spot application and to make two trade choices which were ordered. So they had to make a first choice and a second choice. So this is the information that was displayed to the treatment group. So these are median monthly earning per trade here in dollars, in US dollars, and these were obviously shown in franc CFA. So what you see here is that there is quite a wide variety of median earnings in the trades that were offered in the training, and that the lower region trades are traditionally female trades, like housekeeping, tailoring, etc. So we're going to look at three families of outcomes: earnings estimates, trade choice, and training outcomes. So the first set of outcomes are earnings estimates. And so we asked survey respondents to estimate monthly earnings in two male-dominated trades, auto mechanic and welding, and in two non-male-dominated trades, hairdresser and tailor. Based on these answers, we built the average of earnings in male-dominated trades and the average of earnings estimates in non-male-dominated trades. So on these graphs, the blue bars gives you the estimates in the control group who didn't receive information on earnings, and the red bars give you the estimates in the treatment group who did receive the information on earnings. So what we see here is that men who saw the video with the information on earnings have lower estimates in their traditional trades, in male-dominated trades. There is no significant difference for women. Now, if we turn to non-male-dominated trades, this time it's women who have lower estimates of their own traditional trades, which are the non-male-dominated trades. And the difference is about 10%. It was 11% for men, so the same kind of magnitude. So we see that by seeing the video, there is something happening in terms of what individuals estimate in terms of earnings. And so now we want to ask whether that translates into sector choice. So in terms of sector choice, we're going to look at two things. First, whether the individuals go in a male-dominated trade, or pick a male-dominated trade. And second, we're going to look at each specific sector with dummy variables for each sector. So to define male-dominated trades, we asked several respondents to estimate the proportion of men in each trade. And then we define a trade to be male-dominated as soon as this average estimate was above 70%. So this gives you the list of trades, and the ones that are at the right-hand side of the red bars, are the male-dominated trade. So same kind of graph as before. The red bars are treatment, blue bars are control. You see no movement for men. There are about 89% of men, both in control and treatment group, who picked a male-dominated trade as a first choice. But if you look at women, you see actually a big impact of seeing the video with sector-specific earnings. So what we see here is that in the control group, we have 26.7% of women picking a male-dominated trade, and this increases to 34.6% in the treatment group. So about 30% increase in the likelihood to pick a male-dominated trade. Now, if we turn to sector-specific choice, here you have men on the left, women on the right. Again, the red is the treatment group, the blue is the control group. We see that there is a lot of movement happening. So treatment and control differ quite a lot here, and both for men and women. Interestingly, what we see is that we have more people picking up higher return trades in the treatment group. So these are air conditioning, machine operation, topography, and for men and women, we see that more of the proportion of them picking these trades is higher in the treatment group. We also see that there are less men in the treatment group picking the lower return male-dominated trades, which are general mechanics, auto mechanics, and so on and so forth. And then for women, we also find that they actually opt out of non-male-dominated trades with lower returns. So really at the bottom of the distribution of earnings, like tailoring and hospitality. So the last set of outcomes we're going to look at are training outcomes. And so very briefly, I will just show you that basically, quite reassuringly for us, there is no difference in terms of training outcomes. If we look here at attendance, but the same holds for completion or graduation, between men and women, and between male-dominated trades and non-male-dominated trades. The differences here are not significant. And if anything, what we see is that receiving the information and earnings boosts the attendance of women and also the attendance of men in non-male dominated trades. So there is no adverse effect of receiving the information on earnings on training outcomes. The last thing I wanted to talk about is heterogeneity. So who is more impacted by this information treatment conveyed through the video? So what we find is that the women who cross over after seeing the video had already overcome some barriers. More precisely, we find that women are at least 3 times more likely to cross over when seeing the video if they have higher technical experience than the median, they have higher technical knowledge, or they have a male role model. So the main takeaways of this experiment are the following. If we look at the impact of receiving information on sector-specific earnings, on earnings estimate, we see that men who see the video estimate lower earnings in their traditional trades, and the same holds for women. So women estimate lower earnings in non-male dominated trades. And this is about a 10% revision for both. In terms of trade choice, we see that women become 30% more likely to pick a male-dominated trade if they receive this information. We also find that both men and women go to higher return trades as a result of seeing the video. We have reassuring results in terms of training outcomes because women are not more likely to have worse training outcomes than men. And this is true in all trades, both male-dominated trades and non-male-dominated trades. We also find that seeing the video has very little impact on training outcomes. I will conclude this presentation with some policy implications and thoughts for future research. So we find that this intervention that provides information on sector-specific earnings is a cheap and easy way to desegregate the labor market. We also find that the impact is boosted by other correlates of crossovers, such as technical experience and role model. So that shows that there's a high potential of interventions that will bring the two together, the information and earnings and some role model or experience and technical experience. In terms of future research, I wanted to say that in 2021, which will be 18 months after the end of the training, we will go back to these men and women, and we will be able to see whether women are still working in these male-dominated trades in which they hope to be trained in, and we'll be able to see whether the treatment group, who saw the video with sector-specific earnings, is now making more income. Thank you all.
Very interesting presentation by Leah. Thank you. And now we have the last paper by Dhanushk.
Thank you for coming to my presentation. Today I am going to share my work on women's labor market opportunities and fertility decisions. From the data from International Labour Organization, we can see there are about 68 million women who are working abroad, who move from their own countries looking for better working opportunities. However, what we see during the last decade or so, that there are some restrictions put especially on women's migration throughout Asian region, right? Especially countries like India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and all these countries introduce certain restriction on women's migration based on women's age, intended occupation, destination, and so on, right? So usually the justification from the government side is that they want to protect women or they want to improve child welfare. However, we need to have a good understanding about how women would react to these policies. That's what I am trying to address in my research paper. So my work is based on Sri Lankan restriction. This restriction was put in 2013 and it was based on women's age and age of her child if she has a child. And just to give you an idea what's happening here, this is a graph of annual departures for work from Sri Lanka, and the red line is for women. As you can see, before the introduction of policy here in 2013, it was a stable departure, right? Each year there's going to be a certain number of women who's departing, which was drastically reduced after the introduction of the policy, right? Now this motivated me to look at, okay, there is an effect on women's migration. So how they may have responded to this particular change. So my research question asked the question, how do restriction on potential employment opportunities for women affect their fertility decision? I am able to ask this question because of the fact that restriction is also based on child's age if woman has a child. I'll talk about this restriction little bit more going forward. Just to give you an idea where we are heading with this paper, I look at this particular policy which restricts women's labor migration, essentially limiting their labor market opportunities. And I construct a retrospective panel based on birth histories of women, and using the timing of the policy and the differential restriction based on women's age, I look at how this particular restriction affect their fertility decisions. And what I find is younger women increase their childbearing after the introduction of the policy, while older women decrease their childbearing. I also find that average age of women at first birth decreases. New mothers are more likely to be less educated, and I also find some suggestive evidence to say that there is a lower birth spacing among successive births after the introduction of the policy. So let's go into a little bit of details. So this is just the background information to get familiar with Sri Lankan context. In Sri Lanka, it is estimated that 1 to 1.5 million Sri Lankan people work as migrant workers. If you think about compared to a 21 million population or about 8 million workforce, this is a sizable workforce who is going abroad seeking for jobs. And remittances alone contribute to 9% of the GDP. So this is a sizable industry for Sri Lanka. And if you look at the departure numbers before the policy, half of them are women, and of that women, 86% of women going to be domestic workers in these destination countries, right? Domestic workers are essentially women who are helping around the household, cleaning, going for groceries, and all those day-to-day jobs. And if you think about the destination, 90% of women goes to Middle East from Sri Lanka, and 50% of them goes to Saudi Arabia. Another thing that we want to focus about these women, they are mostly less educated, low skilled, and come from poor households. So this is the background or context for Sri Lanka. Let's look at the details of the policy now. The restriction only targets women, and it only targets women who are going to be domestic workers in those countries. So if you are a woman who are going to migrate to be a nurse, then you won't be targeted under this policy. And the policy was implemented in 2013, and this is the condition structure, right? So I'll go through that step by step. First, let's look at the age of youngest child. So the restriction says if the age of the youngest child of a woman is less than 5 years, then she cannot migrate, right? Irrespective of her age, she cannot migrate in that case. If a woman has a child, or if the youngest child of a woman is older than 5 years of age, then she might be able to migrate for work depending on her age. Here, if woman is younger than 21 years of age, then she cannot migrate. So irrespective of whether she has a child or not, she cannot migrate. If a woman is aged between 21 to 23, she can go only to non-Middle Eastern countries, which represent about 10% of total migration of women. Again, this is about work migration. Then if a woman is aged between 23 to 25, she can go to all the countries except for Saudi Arabia. And if a woman is older than 25 years of age, then she is free to migrate. So this is the condition structure for restriction based on women's own age and age of her youngest child. Now, just to see how this policy is enforced, as you can see, this is women's departure from 1998 to 2016, and this is where the policy is introduced in 2013. And you can see there's a huge drop of departures for domestic workers. This red line is for domestic workers, and other professions you don't see much of a drop after the introduction of the policy, because the policy only target women who are migrating as domestic workers. Now the data I have is coming from Demographic and Health Survey. Now this is a cross-sectional survey, and I'm trying to look at what happened over time. So what I do is create a retrospective panel of women based on her birth history, right? So essentially I take one woman and take last 10 years of her life and check whether in each quarter she had a child or not, right? For my outcome variable, I create an indicator variable saying 1 if she had a birth during one of these quarters, right? That is how I measure the fertility. I focus my study only on poor household because this policy is targeted for women who are migrating as domestic workers, who are more likely to come from poor households, as I mentioned earlier. One of the caveats I have with this data is that I do not have information of women who have already migrated at the time of the survey in 2016, right? And I try my best to address this issue in the paper, in the discussion section. This is the methodology. I am going to use regression discontinuity in time and see whether there is a jump or drop in fertility after the introduction of the policy. Only thing I want to highlight is that the cutoff that I am going to use is 9 months after the introduction of the policy to avoid any pregnancies that happen before the introduction of the policy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this jump or drops for each age group, because the policy affect each of these age group differently. Now, just to get an idea what we should expect, if you are a younger woman who's less than 21 years of age, you cannot migrate right now even if you want. And you have to wait until another 4-5 years until you see your full employment potential. Because of that, a younger woman has incentive to delay their childbearing so that when they're old enough to migrate, they do not have younger kids. Otherwise it would prevent them from migrating. So they have incentive to increase their childbearing if they want to have a child and keep this employment opportunity going forward. Now, for the older women, story is a little bit different because for them, they are allowed to migrate whenever they want. But if they decide to have a child right now, it will restrict them from migrating for another 5 years. So, for them, if they want to keep the employment opportunity intact, there is an incentive to reduce their fertility. So, that's my expectation looking at this condition structure for restriction. This slide shows the results I have, and this is for younger women and this is for older women. As you can see, there's a clear discontinuity at the cutoff for younger women and older women. Younger women increase their fertility by about 1.8 percentage, and older women decrease their fertility by about 0.35 percentage. And I don't see a significant change for age groups in between. I also look at women who are given first birth just to avoid the effect of fertility limits that they might have. And as I can see clear distinction of jump for younger women and drop for older women in this scenario too. To make sure that the jump and drop I see here only coming from this cutoff, I estimated the equation using various cutoffs through taking cutoff as each of these quarters and provide that distribution here. This is the distribution of jumps for younger women for other quarters. And as you can see, what I have here with this policy is a clear outlier for that distribution, showing that this effect is indeed coming from the policy. That is true for the younger women, also for older women. Now, apart from that, given the data I have, I look at certain additional outcomes with respect to child health, child environment, and women's marriage. When it comes to birth weight, I do not see a significant change after the introduction of the policy. However, when it comes to characteristic of the mother of this newborn child after the implementation of the policy, I can see age of mother is lower compared to before the policy. Actually, age of mother at first birth is about 10 months lower before compared to before the policy. And also new mothers seems to be less educated by about 5 months. I also look at the timing of marriage, and I do not see a significant change in marriage timing, which otherwise I would have expected. And however, I see there's a reduced birth spacing among successive births after the introduction of the policy. So to conclude, what I did in my paper is to look at how changing and employment opportunities for women would affect their decision making and especially their fertility decisions. And I observed that younger women and women indeed respond to these restrictions, and younger women increase their fertility and older women decrease their fertility to make sure that seemingly to keep their employment opportunities intact going forward, right? There's some evidence that there's change to child's environment, especially new mothers are 10 months younger at first birth, and mothers have about 0.4 less years of schooling, and birth spacing seems to be have reduced by about 3 months. So these changes would affect child development, which is another area I would like to explore going forward. So what my paper suggests is that even though government's stated goal is to protect mothers and improve child's welfare, there could be unintended consequences because women are responding to these policies because they want to keep their labor opportunities intact. So thank you for listening to my presentation, and if you have any question, please feel free to ask.
Excellent. So now we are done with each of the presentations and we can start with the discussions. And I would request the discussants to stick to 2 or 3 main points they have on the paper, so that we can leave some time for questions from the floor and the other attendees as well.
Should I start the discussion?
Yes, please do. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So I'm discussing the paper from Bryce and Hassani, who investigate the gender wage inequalities in Cameroon. And they find that women are more likely to be selected into informal sector. And in terms of wage, they find that in the informal sector itself, women will see about 12% of wage penalty. And in the formal sector, they see about 6% of wage penalty. So that's the summary of the paper, and I believe they have done a great job in terms of presenting data since they are following few methods to verify their findings, and the fact that they are getting results similar to what they find in region means, I think, it improves the validity of the finding. What I would like to see, especially when it comes to formal sector wage difference, which is like about half of informal sector. But from my understanding with my work in Sri Lanka, that mostly public sector, especially government jobs, essentially do not see big of a wage difference due to the, since because it's a government, and it might, so the 6% might not give a good idea about what actually the wage difference when it comes to the private sector formal jobs. So I would like to see if you can look at informal sector without the government jobs, which could lead to a more finding about these gender wage differences. I would also like, this is more of a question, like to know about how did you deal with wages of self-employed, especially when it comes to agriculture. It's really hard to figure out who gets what wage if there's like a family-owned kind of agriculture. And I would like to know how did you deal with that issue. Thank you and great work.
Okay, excellent. The next discussant, Leah, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure, I can. No problem. I thought we were following the order of the papers. Okay, great. So yeah, so I was discussing Danush's paper, and thank you so much for the opportunity actually to read the paper and discuss it. I found it super interesting. And it's basically looking at the impact of a policy that, to be honest, I was completely unaware of, and which I found quite fascinating. And so this paper, as you just saw, make use of this Sri Lankan policy, which actually limits women work-related migration. And so the assumption behind the policy is that it will increase children and women welfare. But what we see is that given the rules of this policy, it actually creates incentives on women's fertility decisions, and that could actually be detrimental to their health and the health of their children in the long run, even though we don't really know yet if that's what's happening. Because, we don't have, not enough years happen to actually look back to these children and look at their outcomes. But yeah, so I think you really do a great job at showing the impact of the policy on fertility decisions of women. But I think you could still spend a bit more time trying to start looking at the impact on children and women's welfare. So you find this reduction in birth intervals, which is quite substantial. But it's still a 0.3 years, starting from a control mean of 4.5 years. So you're still above the 24 months limit set by the WHO to have safe birth intervals in terms of maternal health. So I was wondering maybe if you tried looking at a dummy for whether the birth interval is below 24, which we know is the limit. So do we have more women switching below this threshold of 24 months old, for instance? And then looking at children themselves, I think you look at the birth weight, and that's very relevant because if women are having their first child younger, we know that's one of the adverse effects we can expect. But you know, even if you don't have many years, I think you could also look, for instance, at height for age Z-score. We know there is a quantity-quality trade-off in fertility decisions, and so if women are having more children, we might fear that maybe they nourish them less or less good. And on this, I would encourage you to look at the difference between boys and girls to see, you know, the adverse effect differentially on boys and girls. And last comment, I find it hard to reconcile the marriage and fertility results, right? So you find this increase in fertility and no change in the marriage dynamic as far as I understand. So no change in the age of marriage, no change in the difference between marriage age and first birth age. But still the age at first birth is decreasing among married women. So how can this be happening? Could it be that there are some measurement errors in some of the dates that are given? Yeah, I'm a bit confused by all that. And so I was wondering also if you look at contraceptive use as an outcome. And so do we see that, you know, those married women use less contraceptives? And yeah, but thanks again. That was super interesting.
Thank you.
We'll ask the presenters to respond to these comments after all the discussion is over. So Nakechi, would you like to go next and discuss the paper?
Yes, thank you. Yes. So I'm discussing the paper titled "I'd Rather Be a Hammer Than a Needle," and information on returns desegregate the labor market, evidence from a randomized experiment in the Republic of Congo. So I like this paper. It explores a potential avenue for increasing women's earnings and well-being through their increased participation in what is traditionally male-dominated roles. I have a few questions and comments for the researchers. Now, in deciding what trades are male versus female dominated, I wondered why they didn't use estimates from the nationally representative survey data rather than responses from a subsample of participants in the experiment. I also wondered about the wage or employment information. So the data that they use is collected from a combination of existing national surveys, which from my understanding are a little dated, so 2009, and then also data that the researchers themselves collected in 2019. I wondered, there was not much information on how this data in 2019 was collected and how consistent it would be with the national estimate. So for example, how were wages captured? Was it in terms of monetary payments, in-kind payments, and that type of information was not contained in the paper. Additionally, in estimating the effects of training on estimated earnings, the researchers said that they used the earnings from 2 male-dominated jobs, that's auto mechanics and welding, and then 2 non-male-dominated jobs. I wondered why of all the trades, these 2 in particular were selected. Were they the most and the least male-dominated roles in the paper, for example? I think that it will be useful to clarify some of these ambiguities. I also would have expected that women who revise their estimates of, would revise their estimates of men's earnings significantly upwards following their viewing of the video. It wasn't the case, however, so I wondered if it implied that women already had an accurate idea of earnings in male-dominated roles. And if this was the case, why did the researchers find that women who received the training then chose male-dominated roles as their first choice? So was there some other aspect of the training besides the information of earnings that women received that were not captured that could have led to this outcome? I thought that it would also be useful to provide some information on how a lot of these variables were measured. So for example, there was something called the motivation score, trade knowledge score, degree of self-esteem, level of technical experience, among others. So some discussion as to how these were constructed would have been useful. I do have a few other comments which I'm happy to share with the researchers much later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nakechi. So the last discussion will be by Herman of Nakechi's paper.
Hello, everyone. It is an honor for me to speak from Cameroon to commend the paper written by Keshi Owo and Monica Lombom from Ghana. They work focus on the question, does job security affect fertility and fertility intention in Ghana? Examine the evidence. In other words, the problem that women encounter in the management of both the family in terms of childbirth and childcare, as well as in terms of the intention to deliver in relation to professional integration, stability in employment, and even more aspiration has higher function. This is a major issue of our century and the global economy with a rise of inequality, sexual harassment, and stigmatization of women. To do this, they use data from the Ghana Living Conditions Survey. Statistical studies have also been used to bring out some obviousness. The main empirical result is that uncertain work environment encourage higher fertility. This is because becoming a parent and having more children can be a way to make the future safer and more predictable. This explanation is particularly true in cities like Ghana's, where fertility is valued. The profile of women, on the one hand, that focus on the family, a mesh who will be more predisposed to seek less restrictive jobs, which offer them a good margin for the management of the family, and women not to focus on family will have attitudes similar to those of men, more aggressive on the job market, ready to take on more rewarding function. The problem that remains in this obligation for women to sacrifice one side for the other, this situation observed in Ghana is very well spread in African countries and particularly in Cameroon, where the woman is still considered as the manager of the household of the family. Even family planning is very little encouraged in the management of crops. Behind this, other, other studies have been carried out and the education of women, their integration into the labor market have returned as sine qua non condition for their well-being. I therefore congratulate the author for this work, the quality of the statistical model used, the result obtained, and above all the recommendations that the author made. Overall, we pretend that combine the managerial development as well by requiring employers to have a, a birth, a child house and the care center on their premise as by extending the length of maternity leave. Otherwise, we can converge on a period of 3 months of full maternity leave and 3 other months, or the schedule can be arranged. The women in this period will start the work with 1 or 2 hours of delay. And we
I think the voice quality, Herman, your voice quality is kind of breaking. So I don't know if everybody feels the same way, but we can't hear
Okay.
you
Yes, I
very
think it's
clearly.
No, I'm
Paul?
not getting all of the comments clearly.
Right.
no.
Yeah.
I think
the
maybe you
voice
can
is
send.
breaking. So what we'll do, so maybe what we can do is, if there are any questions for any of the speakers, we can take it from the other panelists and then probably give 1 minute to each of the speakers to respond to some of the questions that were raised in the discussion. So is there anyone who would like to ask a question to any of the speakers? Please unmute yourself and ask, or raise your hand rather, and then we can. Is there a way of raising a hand here? I don't think so.
I think for panelists, Possible.
Okay, so please unmute yourself and ask the question if you have a question for any of the speakers.
Well, I'll just say hi, this is Kathleen here, that some of my questions were embedded in the discussant comments. So.
Right. Okay, so why don't we have 5 minutes left. So let's start with, I think let's start with Herman, and then he can respond for 1 minute to the comments given by Dhanush. We can go in the order of the papers that were presented. Herman, would you like to respond to
We were having trouble with Herman's audio, so maybe.
Okay, I think he unmuted himself. Can you hear us?
Hello?
Yes, would you like to respond to some of the discussants' comments?
Yes, but just to thank Peru for its intervention, also be right to observe that the informal sector, the large women are in public sector, and in this way, the gap is very small. But we have to extend the study in informal sector, focus on agricultural and seller called in Cameroon Bayam seller. Thank you for these remarks.
Okay. Nakichi?
Hi, Fazana. Okay, well, I couldn't hear. I'm sorry that I could not hear the comments very clearly. I don't know that there was a question. There seemed to be more remarks on the paper, which were very well received. But if there are any questions, I'm certainly happy to take them. Thank you very much.
Sure, yeah, I think I understand. Yeah, it wasn't very clear. So maybe in the author's discussion room, we might be able to get some more details on those comments. So we can go over now to Leah if she wants to respond to some of the points raised by Nakechi.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fazana. So yeah, thank you, Nkechi, for these great comments. Most of them we'll take into account into the next version of the paper. And just to clarify, I think one important point, you're right that it's quite surprising that women don't revise upwards their estimates of what they could earn in a male-dominated trade. This is something we were expecting to start with, and which was partly motivating this intervention. And yet we don't find that. But the reason why we don't find that is that we see that respondents tend to overestimate earnings both in male trade and non-male trade for both of them. So they just think they would earn a lot more than what people actually make in those trades. And interestingly, what we still find is that women, they estimate lower earnings in their traditional trades, so in non-male dominated trades, after seeing the video. So, we think that this is the way the video is operating. So basically you're realizing that you won't earn much as a tailor. And so now you want to be an electrician, basically. So this is more or less the way the information operates. But you're right, that's a bit more far-fetched than what we had in mind originally. Thank you.
Okay, Dhanush.
Hi, thank you, Leo, for your comment. And just to answer a few of them you raised, one of the thing about contraceptives, and the problem is I have just cross-sectional data. It is very hard to look at any other measures than what I have right now, because it doesn't help that I have the cross-sectional data for most of the variables. And about the marriage and fertility, yes, that was my concern too throughout the study, because I was expecting there's some changes to the marriage, at least in the early age period, but I don't see any kind of a movement there. It's just what's changing is that fertility among already married women. So that is something I was looking at, but Right now, I am kind of limited with the data I have. It's, yeah, but I will look at the other measure of child health like height that I think I have. Yeah, I think that's and thank you for the suggestion about birth spacing. I will look that I didn't thought about before. Yeah, so that's about the comments. Thank you for the comments, and it was helpful.
Okay, perfect. So we finished exactly on time. Thank you everyone for your wonderful presentations and for the discussion. And we hope to see you in Meet the Author session right after this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.